10, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm going to begin. Is that
All
okay?
right. Yep.
Okay, class, welcome back. We're in the home stretch now. It's April 19th, which I think is Patriots Day, actually, isn't it? Uh, in Boston, so forth. Uh, well, as we mentioned during the course of the semester, especially in the latter third of the semester, we have quite a number of guest lecturers, very distinguished thinkers and practitioners to augment and supplement all the work you've been doing and reading about. And today we have a real superstar, Rose Gottemoeller, uh, who served in very senior positions, most recently in the Obama administration, which I'll just go over quickly. I won't spend all the time about her background because we could take the whole class to discuss that. Rose is fluent in Russian. She studied Russian at Georgetown and received an MA at the George Washington Elliott School of International Affairs. And she's had a wide variety of experiences in think tanks, in the public sector, and in senior government positions. Among the most notable, I think, were she was the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center in Moscow for almost 3 years, January 2006 to 2008. This is at a very critical time at the end of the Bush administration. I'd love to hear about those experiences too, and the role of a major Western think tank in Moscow. Um, she also served as an acting undersecretary of state uh, and as assistant secretary for arms control verification and compliance. This was during the earlier Obama administration. Um, she was a deputy undersecretary of energy for defense, nuclear nonproliferation in the Department of Energy. But I think most pertinent to us is she became the first, well, a couple of things. First of all, of interest to note, she was the first senior US official ever to attend the memorial of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Japan by the US in World War II. This marked the 70th anniversary of the bombing, and Rose was accompanied by the US Ambassador Caroline Kennedy. It was a very memorable visit. The Japanese, by the way, are still waiting for an apology for the US from the bombings, but we haven't provided that yet. Um, Perhaps most notably, though, she has been the chief of the US New START uh, delegation with the Russians. This is New START we're familiar with, class. This is the treaty that has just been extended now by President Biden and President Putin. And Rose was the chief negotiator of that treaty, representing the United States, and the first woman ever to head a senior nuclear arms control negotiation. So I've asked her also to say a few words just about that special feature of her experience, besides all of the other substantive points she's going to raise. Um, she's written a major book, which will be published in May, on her experiences as the arms control negotiator. And by the way, after finishing up in that post, in the latter part of the Obama administration, she became the first female Deputy Secretary General of NATO, of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, for over a year in fall of 2016 till the end of the Obama administration. So it's an extraordinary series of experiences. She's a true Russian expert and expert on nuclear arms control. She's written a new paper published by the Washington Quarterly, which we distributed to you. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, on the future of nuclear arms control, and she's going to comment and even expand on that. So a lot to cover. Please welcome Rose Gottemoeller. Thank you so much, Rose.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you also to Carl von Bieber for hosting me here today. It's a great pleasure to lecture to this Stanford. Oh dear, this Berkeley audience. Forgive me, I'm on the other side.
I forgot to mention that your current Stanford affiliation, a senior fellow and a distinguished fellow at Stanford.
I started off on the wrong foot, but no, I'm very happy to have
No,
a
that's great.
chance to speak to this distinguished audience at Berkeley. And one thing I will mention is that when I went to NATO at the end of the Obama administration in 2016, it was as an international civil servant. I was actually hired directly by the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. And so I stayed on when the Obama administration had ended, and so experienced NATO during the years of the Trump administration. And that was quite an exciting time for transatlantic policy. I wasn't planning to talk about NATO and Europe today, but if there is interest in this group in talking about that during our discussion period, I will be happy to do so. Certainly, I will say a few things about the necessity of beginning to look at non-strategic nuclear warhead constraints and controls in Europe, which very much will draw in the NATO allies. So that will perhaps be a trigger to talk more about that during our discussion period. But it was a very interesting 3 years to be in Brussels. And frankly, watching the Trump administration from across the ocean was a very interesting experience at a time when the United States was I think really in many ways, at least the US administration was questioning its longstanding role in the transatlantic alliance. So very interesting and important time. But if you like, we can come back to that in our discussion.
Great.
If you haven't had a chance to read my Washington Quarterly piece, I will be sticking with the structure to say a few things, but I really wanted to update you because my thinking has changed somewhat since the fall when I wrote it. It was published in September of 2020. And my thinking has evolved as the Biden administration has come into office and has begun to shape their own policies and how they want to proceed. But also, my thinking was very much shaped, and I do give credit to the Trump administration for taking some important steps in the final months of President Trump's administration. So I wanted basically to update you on the Washington Quarterly piece, but also talk about some of my continuing concerns about the necessity of more attention to new technology for monitoring and verification. That's one of the issues I discuss in that particular article. So first of all, I will point to the fact that just last week, President Biden spoke by telephone to President Putin. It was a momentous week in US-Russian relations. The Russians clearly have been threatening Ukraine, raising huge numbers of troops and equipment along the border between Russia and Ukraine, and really saber rattling in the period. So I thought President Biden was smart to get on the phone with Putin and to put him on notice that we are watching this very closely, and also to say that we should add Ukraine to our bilateral agenda. This was something that certainly President Trump wasn't much interested in, and even after the 2014 invasion of Crimea, President Obama tended to hold this issue at arm's length and depend on the Europeans for trying to negotiate with Putin and with the president of Ukraine now, Zelensky, over the situation in Ukraine. So it's a good thing, I think, in many ways that President Biden last week spoke about the necessity of trying to work together to find a solution to this situation in Ukraine. But he also prominently listed the necessity of getting underway soon with strategic stability talks and talks to negotiate the follow-on treaty to the New START treaty. The president has been very, I think, firm and clear in his view that a 5-year extension of New START is the right thing to do. I agree with that. Be glad once again to discuss it because there was a lot of back and forth with the Trump administration arguing for a shorter time period. But my basic argument is very much linked to US national security interests. The United States of America is about to embark now on a modernization of our nuclear arsenal. It will unfold over the next decade plus, well into the 2030s. But in my mind, we need a stable environment and a predictable environment, at least over the next 5 years, both to find a replacement for the New START treaty, to negotiate that replacement, but also in order to have predictability about what the Russian nuclear weapons complex is doing and what they are doing with their nuclear delivery vehicles. The Russians have just completed their nuclear modernization with a big uptick in modern mobile missiles, for example. And they have hot production lines now for both their missiles and their warheads. The United States is just restoring its production capacity for these systems. And I thought the last thing we needed over the next 5 years, as we're trying to get our modernization up and going, is for the Russians to suddenly decide that, loosened from the constraints of New START, which is 700 delivery vehicles and 1,550 operationally deployed warheads, that they could suddenly build up very, very quickly, and as I've said in public many times, outrun us with regard to the nuclear weapon systems that they could deploy, while we're struggling to get our own modernization up and running. So from this perspective, I thought it was a good decision that President Biden took to just take that 5-year extension and get it into place within just a few days of taking office. And now he is speaking about it. And Putin actually agrees that it's a good thing that we have now this stable and predictable period to negotiate the next phase of nuclear arms control. Now, in the Washington Quarterly piece, I argue for two quick fixes, one of which is the extension of New START for 5 years. But the second was to move forward as quickly as possible with a further reduction on the model of the 2002 Moscow Treaty, where the Bush administration negotiated a further drop below the START 1 levels. That level was 6,000 deployed warheads each. So in the SORT treaty, or the Moscow Treaty, that number was brought down to about 2,200 warheads on each side. But there were no other measures associated with it. The treaty was just a very short little piece of paper. The fact was, at that time, the START treaty remained in force, and the monitoring and verification regime of START remained in force. Everything to do with, the procedures, the notifications, the way we exchange data, all of that remained in force thanks to the START treaty. So this additional reduction was kind of layered on the top of START, and I call it, it rode on the back of the START treaty. Well, my argument in the Washington Quarterly piece was we could do another SORT treaty. We could do another Moscow treaty with an additional reduction in operationally deployed warheads that would ride on the back of the New START treaty. And the New START treaty would be essentially the implementation mechanism for this new reduction. I do think that is still possible, and it may be something that I hope it's something that the Biden administration will consider. They now have to do their own review of nuclear policy, obviously. On the books, we have the Joint Chiefs of Staff decision back in 2013 during the Obama administration that they are ready to take an up to 1/3 further reduction in operationally deployed warheads down to a level of, as few as 1,000 operationally deployed warheads each. That decision has never been formally superseded, although indeed the Trump administration argued strenuously that the geopolitical situation has changed in the world so that those kinds of further reductions should not be considered. I am now waiting, as many are, to see exactly what stance the Biden administration will take, whether they will be willing to undertake further reductions on that model from 2013, or smaller reductions or bigger reductions. We don't know, because they have to carry out their own review of the nuclear numbers, and of course work closely with the Joint Chiefs on that matter. So we'll see whether we get that as another step. But in the meantime, we are facing the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference coming up later this year. I believe it will take place in August. And it's at a difficult time for the NPT regime, because the so-called TPNW has also entered into force this year. That is the so-called nuclear ban treaty that makes nuclear weapons illegal according to international law and according to that treaty. That is something with which the United States has not agreed, because outlawing nuclear deterrence would in many ways place us and other nuclear weapon states in a very difficult position with regard to international law, with regard to the way we deploy and operate our nuclear forces. And frankly, I've also been concerned historically that the NPT would be undermined by the existence of the ban treaty. Now we have the ban treaty in place. It's the reality of the situation. So I am urging that we need to think for ways to make the two treaties work together. But the fact of the matter is, this ban treaty out there serves as a kind of stick to beat the NPT system. And so I have argued, for that reason, the Biden administration needs to look for some quick gesture. I think a new Moscow treaty, a new SORT treaty would be great if they can accomplish it in time. but if their review process will not let them accomplish it in time, I say, why don't we look at a quick parallel unilateral step? If you look at the last New START data exchange last month, the United States and Russia are already approximately 100 below the number allowed of operationally deployed warheads. So under the treaty, 1,550 warheads are allowed, and both the United States and Russia have approximately 1,450 operationally deployed warheads. Is it a big deal? No. But to take that kind of gesture in parallel and to say, yes, for the meantime, we will continue to keep these numbers lower than what is allowed under New START, I think could boost our chances for a successful non-proliferation treaty review conference later on in the year, and certainly would establish the bona fides of the Biden administration as being again, trying to work in good faith with the NPT community to advance the goals of the NPT, which include, over the long run, the total elimination of nuclear weapons under Article 6 of the NPT, also includes, of course, advancing non-proliferation goals and also advancing the goals of peaceful uses of the atom. So again, happy to come back to that during our Q&A period, but I do think that that juxtaposition of the Biden administration coming into office, the advent of the TPNW, the ban treaty, and the fact that we have a non-proliferation treaty review conference this year means that we have to think very seriously about at least some gestures in order to show that the United States remains serious about its commitments under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's where I think I'd head if I were going to talk about some quick fixes now. I'd continue to urge the Biden administration to see whether they could do another reduction and another sort-like treaty. But if they can't, why not just take a small step and acknowledge the smaller numbers that are already being deployed under New START and get the Russians to sign up to that as well as a kind of goodwill gesture taken in a parallel unilateral way. And by the way, I don't know if you've had a chance to study them, but there are precedents for this in the so-called presidential nuclear initiatives from the early 1990s at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So it's not a new kind of thing by any means. Now let's move on and talk about what I consider the longer term middle distance. I've talked so far mainly about the US-Russian dynamic, and indeed, because the United States and Russia have still, to this day, 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world between the two of us, I do continue to believe that we are responsible for continuing to drive this agenda very hard. However, it's also clear, and this was one of the contributions that the Trump administration made, that it's high time that China be brought into the discussion. Not necessarily to jam them into the New START treaty, which didn't make any sense to me. That was something that the Trump administration tried. You know, you've got the United States and Russia up here with 1,550 strategic warheads deployed, and the total number of Chinese warheads is way, way below that. The Pentagon this last September said they have approximately 250 total warheads. Those numbers, of course, are disputed. There's a lot of debate about them. But you can tell by looking at any number of unclassified sources that at least, if you're looking at the big percentages, the United States and Russia are up in the thousands and China is still down in three figures. So it didn't make sense to me to try to shoehorn them into the New START treaty, but I think we need to look for areas where they have some equivalence of capability and may see some interest in coming to the table. And the main area I think that they see some interest is in restoring constraints on intermediate range missiles that are ground launched. You know, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty went out of force in 2019 when the United States withdrew and the Russian Federation followed. The reason for that was the very serious Russian violation of the INF Treaty by building and deploying this missile called the 9M729, a very capable ground-launched cruise missile that they began to deploy and have now deployed both in Europe and in the Asiatic part of Russia. So there's no constraints on this range of missiles anymore. Why is that troublesome? Why should it be troublesome to the Chinese? Well, it's the same old argument. Again, if you look back at the history, these are missiles that either are very fast flyers. If they are ballistic missiles, they fly to targets very, very quickly within 15 minutes of launch. And if they are cruise missiles, then they are stealthy and they can arrive at targets also with very little warning. And so in the 80s, it was the same argument that they posed a decapitation threat, that they could be used to decapitate critical command and control nodes, including national command authorities that would be used for the command and control of the nuclear forces. So now suddenly these kinds of constraints have gone away. I'll tell you, interesting that I'm taking part in quite a few track 2 discussions with the Russians now, and the Russians have suddenly started to mourn the demise of the INF Treaty. I find it hugely ironic because I worked so hard when I was undersecretary to try to get them to admit that we needed to save the INF Treaty. And they were like, we don't care. We're ready to get out. Who cares? And they never acknowledged the existence of this missile. They obviously wanted to push the blame onto us, and they actually succeeded pretty well in doing that. But now they are mourning the loss of the INF Treaty, and the Chinese are getting nervous as well. Why is that? Well, when I was at NATO as the Deputy Secretary General, after the demise of the INF Treaty, the Russians put a moratorium proposal on the table. And the first time the Russian senior diplomat came to me to present it to me, I said, this is nothing but a propaganda ploy, because you're saying we are going to keep all intermediate range missiles out of Europe. You are not admitting that the 9M729 is an intermediate range missile. So you're saying that that missile could stay in place, but the United States should not be allowed to deploy new ground-launched missiles to counter that missile. I said, this is strictly a propaganda ploy. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I was quite critical of it at the time. So was NATO as a whole, the United States clearly as well. But interestingly, in October of 2020, President Putin put on the table what I call the refreshed moratorium deal. And in that moratorium deal, he offered to put the 9M729 on the table. He said, we do not agree or admit that this missile flies to intermediate ranges, but as an expression of goodwill, we will be willing to remove it from deployment in European Russia and monitor and verify that fact. Now that begins to look interesting, because we at NATO, we were very concerned again about the short flight time and very high accuracy. Not the 9M729 is an air breather, it's a cruise missile. They have some other very capable ballistic systems as well that are coming online, but we were concerned about its stealthy characteristics and the fact that it could arrive at target with little warning in any event. And so now that the 9M729 is on the table, I've been urging that the administration take a good hard look at it, and certainly that the European allies take a good hard look at it, and particularly decide what we need with regard to monitoring and verification. Again, when Putin first put the offer on the table in October, it seemed to indicate he seemed to indicate that they'd be willing to offer up some kind of transparency visits like to Kaliningrad, and that would be it. But the Russians have been much more detailed since, and indeed Putin himself at the highest level has underscored that they would be willing to remove the missile from European Russia to east of the Ural Mountains and put in place a monitoring and verification regime to cover all of European Russia. In return, of course, for the United States not deploying its new ground-launched cruise missile in Europe, and also for monitoring and verification in the NATO European countries. So it's a deal worth looking at. Now, what happens next? All of those missiles go east of the Urals. The Chinese are going to start to sit up and take notice. In fact, they already are sitting up and taking notice. Of course, they and the Russians never admit openly that they target each other, but when a lot of very capable modern Russian missiles begin to appear in the Russian Far East, you can believe it, the Chinese are paying attention. And so all of a sudden, the Chinese seem interested in considering what might be possible in terms of placing some constraints on intermediate range ground launched missile systems. Indeed, they've broadened the scope and said, well, if we're going to control these kinds of missiles in intermediate ranges, we might as well go for the sea and air launched ones as well. It's a long history of the United States trying to keep its, especially conventionally armed sea launched cruise missiles off the negotiating table. So we'll see how that goes. But the main point I want to emphasize for you is that in refreshing constraints on intermediate range missiles, two things. First of all, I would not at all recommend returning to the INF Treaty. Although that treaty was called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, it actually banned all cruise missiles that are ground launched in intermediate range, as well as ballistic missiles. And that was because we couldn't distinguish between conventional and nuclear missiles, so we just banned all of them. Nowadays, the Russians depend on these missiles, the Chinese depend on these missiles, but mostly their capabilities are conventional in nature. They can still be quite destabilizing, but I think it should be possible with the verification techniques we have available today. Again, during our Q&A, I'd be happy to talk to you more about why I think this is now much more verifiable than in the past, but you could actually place a ban on all nuclear armed intermediate range missiles. Or if you didn't want to ban them all, you could limit them and then have a verification regime that would monitor that limit. Clearly, a ban is easier to verify than a limit, but I think either would be possible. And I think that that's going to be important for the Chinese because they very much depend on missiles in these ranges for their missions and objectives. Of course, we are concerned about them. They're the missiles, the Chinese missiles that we call the carrier killers. So we would very much like to see some constraints. The US has an interest here. China has an interest. I think Russia has an interest as well. They want to keep US ground launched cruise missiles out of Europe and also out of Asia, number one. But also, I think they keep a sharp eye on Chinese buildups and would very much like to begin to see some kind of negotiated restraint in this area with the Chinese. So we will see what is possible, but I do applaud the Trump administration's insistence that it's high time China begins to come to the negotiating table. I will say that they tried to jam them, I think. They tried to push them too far too fast, and the Chinese reacted to that. I think my view of the matter would be, we'll see where the Biden administration goes, but we don't try to rush them immediately into formal negotiations, but begin with a series of strategic stability talks that makes the case to them how it could be stabilizing for them to have some of these negotiated measures in place with monitoring and verification, particularly for intermediate range systems. So I would take it as a longer process, beginning with discussions and only proceeding after some period of time and perhaps some confidence building measures to a more formal negotiation. But we will see where that goes. So to sum up, it looks to me like the other high priority for the administration will be trying to restore some system of constraint on intermediate range ground launched missile systems, whether ballistic or cruise. They will go about that, I believe, although not clear. Again, I'm speaking for myself here. I don't have any special insider information about what the Biden team is thinking, but I do think that it will be quite possible to do a kind of regional restraint system. First of all, having the moratorium on such missiles in Europe, and second, then negotiating with the Chinese for some regional restraints that could leave the door open in future for perhaps bringing in some other regional powers that deploy such missiles, including both Pakistan and India, also including the DPRK, depending on where discussions with them go about getting them back to the negotiating table, and also could include the Iranians, about whom we've been very concerned with regard to their missile developments. So I think if we get a trilateral activity going on a regional basis in Asia, it could be used as a precedent for drawing in other countries in the future. But we will see. That's my optimistic assessment. I think optimism has to be one of the tenets of any arms control negotiator. But again, we'll see what will be possible. Now let me turn to warheads, because the other big contribution, in my view, of the Trump administration was to finally get the Russians to agree in principle and at the highest level to the notion that warheads should be controlled directly. historically, in starting in the strategic arms limitation talks of the 1970s and proceeding to this very day with the New START Treaty, we do not control warheads directly. We control them by dint of their association with their delivery vehicles. So, for example, the Russians have an ICBM. Let's say it's one of the big ICBMs with 10 warheads, an old SS-18. They take that missile out of deployment. They eliminate it under the treaty. We can see that the missile goes away. These are big items of hardware. We watch the conversion and elimination processes under the treaty measures, and we can confirm that they've eliminated the missiles. The warheads go back to their storage facility. They are off the missiles, so they no longer pose an immediate threat to the United States. And in that way, we say the missile is eliminated and the warheads are limited because they are out of operational deployment. They are off of the missiles. They are back in storage where they're not a real-time threat to the United States. This is the precedent we have followed because it was always so sensitive to try to monitor and verify warheads. And not only the Soviets and the Russians have felt this way, but we have felt this way as well. We, the United States, did not want the Soviets and nowadays the Russians poking around in our sensitive warhead facilities. And so for that reason, we were always willing, along with Washington and Moscow, to have this kind of limitation system by dint of association with the delivery vehicles. Nowadays, and here again, the Trump administration, I think, made a big contribution by putting in place the principle and getting Putin to agree with it and they proposed it initially as a freeze on warheads. There would be an overall freeze on the existing number of warheads, and then some monitoring and verification would be developed to monitor that freeze. Of course, that's a unilateral gesture, to say we're freezing, you're freezing, but it could then have some other elements attached to it, such as an exchange of data and such as a monitoring regime to watch whether new warheads were being produced, for example, while older warheads were not being destroyed. So I know the Trump administration had some opportunity to work this before they left office. And the Russians agreed to it initially, although in the negotiating process, they became, I think, more and more nervous once again about what monitoring and verification could mean. And now, with the advent of the Biden administration, the Russians have taken that off the table again, that agreement to a freeze. Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Rybkov said a couple of months ago, back in February, that no longer were they willing to leave on the table that offer of a freeze that President Trump had gotten President Putin to agree to. But nevertheless, in any arms control negotiation, once again, you grab at precedents and you hang on to them tight. So again, I've been urging the Biden administration to grab on and hold on to that precedent and try to bring it back to the table again as quickly as possible, to say to the Russians that it is high time we begin to negotiate direct constraints on warheads and to seek measures to monitor and verify those constraints. That will be important, not only as a matter of beginning to get a handle on so-called non-strategic nuclear warheads, of which the Russians have a very large number, but also, and you may know that this has been a matter of grave concern for a number of our Republican colleagues, but it's also been a matter of concern in a bipartisan way that the Russians haven't been willing or in any way ready to dive in and try to place some limits on their non-strategic or sometimes called tactical nuclear warheads, for shorter range systems. At the same time, I think everyone in the expert community agrees now, again, that the Trump administration did us all a service by establishing the principle that the limit should be on all warheads, strategic and non-strategic, not just focusing on the TAC nukes, not just focusing on the shorter range systems and the smaller warheads, but try to place a direct limit on all warheads, strategic and non-strategic. So that's a step forward. Let's see what we can make of it in the upcoming period. But these kinds of constraints will have to draw in the NATO allies. And frankly, the NATO allies historically have been nervous. We were nervous about having the Soviets poke around in our warhead facilities. The NATO allies are very nervous about having the Russians poke around in their facilities, their bases, where the relatively small number of nuclear warheads are deployed that are part of the NATO nuclear mission. So again, we can come back to that again, but in terms of the priorities, I wanted to make sure that you knew that not only seeking a replacement for INF, but also this matter of seeking direct limits on warheads and proceeding to develop a reasonable monitoring and verification regime that allows us to keep our sensitive secrets, but still to understand that warheads are being limited and eliminated. Limited, controlled, and eliminated. This is going to be an important goal for the next round of negotiations with the Russians. So with that, and before I turn to the negotiations themselves of the New START treaty, I just wanted to raise one issue with you and let you know I am really, really interested in monitoring and verification and how it can change and develop as we have now more ubiquitous sensors available to us, such as the large constellations of commercial satellites that are now imaging the Earth, in multiple spectra on a 24/7 basis, and it's going to get even more. Those constellations are going to get even more capable as time goes by. At the same time, we have some of the analytical tools available, thanks to big data analytical tools that we can actually sort out the wheat from the chaff and understand what is important for monitoring certain obligations in an arms control treaty. So I did teach a course at Stanford in winter quarter on monitoring of 21st century arms control treaties and agreements. A lot of very interesting new technologies are out there. My students built their projects around what's available. And I have to say, I'm super impressed. So I come away from that experience and my own work feeling even more hopeful than ever that we will be able to get a handle on this sensitive area of warhead monitoring and verification, that we will understand better exactly how the DPRK nuclear program is unfolding. I'm sure many of you are aware of the work that is being done by NGOs, including the Monterey Institute in this area. And this is just going to continue. So I think it's a very fruitful area for further exploration. I don't know if you've had an interest of that kind at Berkeley or in any of your courses, whether you've tackled these issues, but I wanted to raise it and flag it for you, and certainly be very glad to talk about it more during our Q&A period. Okay, let's turn over in my last few minutes before I open the floor for discussion. I would like to show you just the cover of my book that's going to come out in, well, I've been told that it should be out by the, there we go. So this is from the Cambria Press, and it will be coming out in May. It's quite an adventure, I have to say, and it was quite an adventure writing this book during the COVID-19 lockdown, but it allowed me to go back and really reflect at length without many disturbances or difficulties exactly what went on in that negotiation. Here you see our final plenary at the US mission in Geneva. You see the back of my counterpart's head. That's Ambassador Anatoly Antonov, now the ambassador of the Russian Federation to the United States, currently withdrawn back to Moscow for some consultations. But this was a very important period when we negotiated this treaty in 2009, 2010, because it was a period when we actually had a kind of mini detente. Remember the famous reset button? That was the period at the beginning of the Obama administration when the president of the Russian Federation was a man named Dmitry Medvedev. Do you remember Dmitry Medvedev?
Absolutely.
We tend to think and say among ourselves in the West that he never stood up to Vladimir Putin. But I have ample evidence, and it's laid out in detail in the book, that on the New START treaty negotiations, he did stand up to Vladimir Putin. And I'll say a few words about that, how that came to be. When he and Obama first met in London in April of 2009, and that's when the famous reset button was presented. And I don't know, I call it one of the funniest diplomatic gaffes in history, that whoever translated reset button translated it wrong. So it actually meant overload, the overload button, like the overload of an electrical circuit. They needed to, instead of saying perigruska, they needed to say perizagruska for reset of the relationship. So the Russians had a really good time when we first started meeting in plenary session, teasing us about this. And so I kept just saying to them, well, actually the relationship has been overloaded. So we need now to have a reset of the relationship. Let's get away from this overload problem. And frankly, we got so busy in the negotiations that they kind of dropped teasing us after a while, but it was a funny little episode. But to make a long story short, Medvedev and Obama did agree early that they needed to work hard to try to develop a more positive agenda in a broad sense, but also narrowly, they agreed on our initial instructions for the New START treaty negotiations. And that is the most important lesson. Well, it's a lesson I knew before, but it's a lesson for any negotiator. Make sure that you understand your national security objectives and that they are clearly agreed by the rest of your government, including at the highest level by the President of the United States. And if at all possible, to start a successful negotiation, your counterparts should have the same national security objectives for themselves, and they should be agreed throughout their governments, including at the highest level. So the fact that in April of 2009, we had a statement signed in London by President Obama and President Medvedev stating two things importantly. First, that we needed to negotiate quickly to achieve a New START treaty. It wasn't called that at the time, it was called the START follow-on, but to achieve a new treaty by December of 2009 when START was going out of force. That was the first tasking. The second tasking was that we would be negotiating about strategic offensive forces. This turned out to be vital because here was the key difference between Medvedev and Putin. Medvedev, and frankly, I think given my knowledge of what was going on in the Ministry of Defense and in the general staff, Medvedev was hearing from the generals that, yeah, we want to focus on getting US strategic offensive forces under control. We're not so worried about their missile defenses. We can defend against their missile defenses. We have put a lot of investment into chaff and decoys and whatever would be required to confuse their missile defenses should they ever try to go after one of our ICBMs in flight. But it's evident and clear to me that Putin, then the Prime Minister of Russia, did not agree with that, and he pressured the Medvedev administration from early on to try to force missile defense into the negotiations. And it's a long and difficult story, but the idea of directly limiting missile defenses is political suicide in the United States. Again, we can talk about this. I don't know if you've had a chance to discuss it in class, but the notion of trying to limit missile defense at the negotiating table ended, I think, when the US withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. And
Right.
ever since that time, the notion of putting new limits on missile defenses has been simply forbidden,
Okay.
even to consider it too politically difficult. So I had this great actual tool, this statement signed by the two presidents in London, where we said again and again and again, no, we won't talk about limiting missile defenses. Our presidents agreed that this would be about strategic offensive forces only, reducing and eliminating them and replacing as a direct replacement the limitations of the START treaty. Before I leave this initial point, I'll just mention that I'm so glad now, looking back in retrospect, that nobody actually questioned that timeline, because it was unprecedented to try to complete a strategic arms reduction treaty in 6 months, get it through the Senate with advice and consent of the Senate to ratification and getting it into force. It was simply unprecedented. The START treaty had taken 6 years on and off to negotiate and another 2-3 years to get through the advice and consent process. Of course, that also was the period of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the START treaty was used as the mechanism for denuclearization of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So there were a lot of complex pieces that prevented START from entering into force quickly. But the bottom line was, I was really glad as the chief negotiator that nobody actually said to me, really? You think you can get this done in 6 months? And the point was that the Russians had the same marching orders. They understood that they had to work quickly, fast. There'd be no slow rolling. We needed to get this done. And so those were two very important aspects of the initial tasking and instructions from our presidents. So that's the first thing. Make sure you know what your national security objectives are, and try to make sure that at least there is there's some common objectives there with your counterpart. You may not share all the same objectives, but make sure there's some common objectives and that they can be agreed at the highest level. Now, let me turn to the aspect of this that has to do with being a female negotiator. I actually say in the book, I don't think I was particularly unique in the way I managed the delegation, but it was something new to have a female negotiator. First of all, my Russian counterpart, although we had known each other in Moscow when I was director of the Carnegie Moscow Center for 3 years, he was really uncomfortable because the Russians are quite misogynistic, and the notion of having a female counterpart at the negotiating table made him uncomfortable. And then there was some really tough criticism in the Russian press saying, "Oh, he's negotiating with a girl, is he? Oh, well, let's see, is she going to get the better of him?" So there was that kind of nastiness going on in the Russian media that made it really difficult to get off on the right foot in the negotiations. And I thought to myself, oh man, this is going to result in some pretty nasty games playing as we began the negotiating process. And sure enough, there was some pretty nasty games playing on his part. He told me right at the outset that he loves to play games, and being a good Russian diplomat, he's very good at it. They are extremely well trained. They know their business, and they certainly know how to knock their counterparts off balance. But as I always say, two can play at these games. And I think that's the key lesson that I took away. I understood it from having dealt with the Russians for many years, but two can play at these games. You don't just have to sit back and take it. So I decided that I was going to reach out to the back row of his delegation. In his front row, only men. The generals, the colonels, the experts on missile technology from the Russian industries, whoever they were, all men at the front table, except for the very capable interpreter. Their chief interpreter, of course, chief interpreters always sit next to the chief negotiator. So that was the only woman at the front table with on the Russian side. I'm happy to say I had several really good women at senior levels in my delegation, so that was great. But I decided to start reaching out to the back row, where not only did they have excellent linguists and translators, but also some very good lawyers, Russian women lawyers, very, very good, and some other experts. So I started reaching out to the back row and, sending them little gifts. Like I sent them White House Christmas ornaments that first year. And as we got into February of 2010, it was Mardi Gras time, and one of my members of the delegation got a big box of Mardi Gras beads. So I sent them down to the Russian mission in a basket with a big note that said, "These are for the women in the delegation." Wouldn't you know, the men got really bent out of shape about this. They said, "Where are my beads?" And I thought, oh, now I'm beginning to get under their skin. Well, all of this was fun, but the most important thing was that I kept at nagging my counterpart to say, you should allow a woman to speak. And finally, toward the end of the negotiations, he did allow one of their very capable lawyers to come to the table and to make a presentation on some important legal issues in the negotiations. And when she opened her dossier to begin to speak, she said, "Well, at last it's my turn to speak." And I was very, very glad. I felt, frankly, that was one of my successes on the negotiations, that my nagging paid off in this case. But I will say that I think it's going to be a long time before there's an array of leaders at the upper end of the Russian interagency. You look now at the Biden picks for senior positions throughout the government, many, many women, as well as very capable men being selected. You just don't see that in the Russian interagency, and I greatly regret it. But that long history and culture of misogyny continues very much to determine how their government is structured. So let's see, I've talked, it's almost 3 o'clock, and I don't want to dominate the floor for too long. So why don't I throw it open now to questions and discussion, and look forward to taking the conversation any place you'd like to go.
Mansuk, do you want to call on the people?
So Anthony and Jake, and then Morgan. Anthony, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Thanks. Basically, thank you so much for your presentation. It's super helpful. But one thing that I found extremely confusing, like especially reading the recent news, is that for for the general nations, we can understand that U.S. may actually using like a certain way to actually kind of enforcing the commencing of these kind of like treaties. But for nations like Russia and China, um, is there like certain effective way that even though with like a certain technology like verifications that could in kind of enabling us to actually allow the things still on the right track? Because like for Russia, we already have sanctions, and for China, like we have tons of like import and export trade, and the trade war last year shows up like a sanction won't benefit any of us.
Well, these are some excellent questions, and they are questions, frankly, Anthony, that we really grappled with during the period when the Russians were seriously violating the INF Treaty. Because by that time, it's a weird thing, but the INF Treaty was a perpetual ban on treaties in these ranges. And so the verification regime for the INF Treaty lasted only as long as the missiles were being eliminated. And once elimination of the missiles was completed, then the verification regime went away. So we didn't even have, in the case of the INF Treaty, we didn't even have that compliance instrument. Inside the four walls of a treaty regime, the verification and monitoring system is very important as a compliance instrument. You have a way to go to the Russians in that case or any other state and say, look, we know that you are engaging in some questionable behavior. Here's what that questionable behavior is. Here's what the evidence is. You seem to be stepping outside the bounds of the treaty, and we've been able to monitor and verify that. So that was a real problem with the INF Treaty, that we didn't even have those tools available to us anymore. And the Russians just kept denying the existence of the missile. Again, I think, credit to the Trump administration, they got the Russians to acknowledge the existence of the missile, but then they said, but this missile doesn't fly to intermediate ranges. They haven't yet admitted that it flies to intermediate ranges. So that's an important thing. I think, frankly, the instruments of response to misbehavior always, have to be able to be proportional. I thought President Biden was very good in emphasizing proportionality. And they have to be designed in order, in my view, particularly with regard to an arms control treaty or agreement, bringing the country back into full compliance with the treaty or agreement so the treaty can continue to be effective. If, as in the case of INF, the other country is hollowing out the treaty from inside, not admitting to any violation, and just forgetting their obligations under the treaty, then it's not worth staying in the treaty for the other countries involved. And that, in the end, is the ultimate threat, that the treaty itself will go away and nobody will be constrained. And so my view is that you try to keep implementation issues around or in the four walls of the treaty and work them in that way. Because I think the larger instruments that we have available, like sanctions regimes, for example, are already getting plenty of usage for trying to change Russian behavior in other areas. And I would not see their effectiveness in this kind of arms control setting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jake, are you next?
Yes. Well, thank you for the really amazing and informative talk. My question is in regards to verification technology. It sounds like you have more to say about it than you wanted to talk about in the hour that you were given. And I would just like to hear more about what verification technologies are you particularly interested in? I'm a computer scientist, and I'm particularly interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I'd just be interested in hearing more about, what technologies are you particularly excited about, and yeah.
Well, I'm very excited about ubiquitous sensing of all kinds. And that could be, as I said, the large new satellite constellations that are out there. It can also relate to, the kinds of sensing systems that are now available on widely dispersed mobile platforms. And I think they've already proven their worth in certain settings. Not a lot of people know, but after the Fukushima power plant disaster, the Japanese local population were not trusting the government numbers on the radiation in the region around the power plant, and they began, with the help of some developers, they turned their mobile phones into radiation detectors. I'm not quite sure. Some of you may know the technology, but apparently, if you close the camera off and download one of the apps that was developed, you turn your phone into a radiation detector. And it ended up being a benefit to the Japanese government because they ended up mapping the radiation contamination around Fukushima with the help of the public in a much more precise way than they had been able to accomplish themselves. So I'm also interested in possibilities in some settings for citizen participation. I recognize, of course, the privacy concerns and the dangers inherent in certain settings. Hello? Okay, in certain settings, I recognize that there are some problems with that, but I think there are a lot of ways to think about improving our ability to monitor and verify arms control treaties and agreements. And I'm really excited about the tools that are coming available that help us basically to separate the wheat from the chaff. And that gets to the tools of big data analysis. So it's a very, I think, very important future. The biggest problems nowadays, I think, are going to be selling some of these things, because one of the things that came through to me in this course that I just taught is how dominant the United States is at the moment with, first of all, the amount of commercial activity compared to almost any other country. The Chinese themselves starting to take some steps in that direction. The Russians way behind. How are you going to get everybody in an arms control regime to sign up to your commercial satellites and how good they are? If you cannot establish their authoritativeness and get others to agree to their authoritativeness in providing imagery, then they're not going to be useful. So there are a lot of both technical questions, but also policy questions that are related to uneven distribution of these resources and assets nowadays.
Thank you.
Okay, Morgan, you're next.
I also, first off, thank you. This has been really interesting. And I also come from a cyber and AI background, and have a question on the use of commercial satellites for monitoring. When I was reading your article, I immediately thought of how reliance on commercial infrastructure and cybersecurity has shifted public-private roles. So the private sector takes on higher responsibility, like Microsoft calling itself the first responder of cyberspace, and even acting as a norm setter. And then the private sector also becomes vulnerable to attacks from nation state actors. So my question is, in the nuclear realm, what challenges do you see with increased use of commercial infrastructure for monitoring?
Yeah, well, the first one, as I said, is negotiability and getting other parties in the negotiations to accept the authoritativeness of commercial assets of that kind. But the other one is very much, again, related to the questions I think we all have about the reliability of some of these systems in terms of their downlinks, how they're communicating with the Earth, can they be meddled with in various ways? So again, what's the reliability of the data going to be, and how can that be assured over time? So I recognize that there are many, many questions in this space, but I think I look to what we consider now national technical means in our arms control treaties and agreements. They relate to large USG satellites, many of them in geosynchronous orbits that take only certain swaths of photographs, images, not on a very regular basis. And I think we're missing a bet if we're not taking greater advantage, particularly of the capabilities now to monitor and analyze change at particular sites on a 24/7 basis. And in some cases, for many, many years, we've not had adequate coverage by US government assets of areas where there's a lot of cloud cover normally and that type of thing. And the new satellites operating in multiple spectra are beginning to address some of those issues. So I remain hopeful, but I agree, Morgan, there's many, many issues to be confronted, and cybersecurity very much among them.
Thank you.
Daniel, you're next.
Sure, thank you. So it's been a pleasure to hear you speak. You mentioned one of the aspects of your work in navigating this field, which is very strongly tied to the lives and deaths of many, many people as a woman. So I wanted to ask, how did you stay sane, or what are some tips you have on staying sane in interacting with men in this space that sort of handle this whole system, that treat this life or death situation like a game?
Oh, it's a great question, Daniel. I think for any, and this goes for any manager, whether they're working to manage frankly a grocery store or working to manage a nuclear weapons establishment. It won't surprise you, such simple tools as the use of humor and trying to keep things in perspective, trying to set priorities and order what is most important, and so forth. Yes, it can be a challenge. It has been a challenge for me to set those priorities and to try to keep everybody focused, because we had, with the presidents breathing down our neck that way, and believe me, President Obama breathed down my neck sometimes quite personally, and was very concerned about the pace of the negotiations. So you really have to keep your eye on objectives, and you have to push forward. And sometimes those bigger issues of the existential nature of the threat we were dealing with in terms of nuclear weapons get lost a bit in that kind of setting. But the reason that we continue, and that the Russians continue after so many years, we got started at this after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, was because that coming to the brink in that way of existential destruction really, I think, launched us on an effort to negotiate and to figure out ways to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons through negotiation. So I do have a great respect for that history, and I think sometimes I regret to say I'm afraid we almost need another brush with disaster of that kind to get people to take this issue more seriously, but I hope that that is not the case. Now, Sasha, you're next. Great question.
Hi, yeah, thank you again for a wonderful talk. It was absolutely captivating. I just had a question about how you envision negotiations going with Russia, or continuing going with Russia, especially with all of the stuff with Navalny that is happening in Russia right now. Because I do assume that in the past things have caused tiffs in negotiations, or kind of slow negotiations. And I was wondering what you kind of envision with all of that that's going on right now, and what might potentially happen.
I think that's one of the great unknowns right now, Sasha, is how well, because it's clear President Biden is trying to wall off strategic stability talks and further nuclear reduction talks as an area that will continue to move forward despite all the other very difficult developments in the relationship. But if something happens, heaven forbid, like Navalny gets very sick or dies or something, the best intention to continue to negotiate again. And I think there's a clear argument for doing so, because nuclear weapons are an existential threat to the United States, to the Russian Federation, and frankly, to the globe. So there's a good argument there for continuing to negotiate, as we did throughout the Cold War, despite many, many differences between us. But sometimes, frankly, political developments do get in the way, and must get in the way. So there could be a delay in trying to move forward. But I was encouraged that President Biden so clearly stated that we should try to wall off the issues related to nuclear weapons and move forward in trying to constrain them with the Russians. So we will see what happens. But you're absolutely right. It's impossible sometimes to keep those larger political issues at bay as we try to confront the nuclear reduction issues as well. Preston, you're next.
Thank you again for speaking with us. Could you shed some color on why the Russians seem to regret the dissolution of the INF, and how might that affect future negotiations in both the non-nuclear and nuclear domain?
Yeah, the reason I'm laughing so hard about it is now they're saying, well, all of a sudden in these second track talks, they're saying repeatedly to us, well, what are we going to do to replace INF? You know, we need something in place to replace INF. We don't like the fact that there aren't any constraints on it. They're pretty blunt about it, Preston. They haven't been hiding their cards at all. They've been very blunt about saying that they regret the loss of the INF treaty. And I want to say to them, again, it's so ironic since I started in, the first time I demarched the Russians was in 2013 on this. And I said, hey, you're violating INF. What are we going to do to save the treaty? And they just wouldn't work the issue at all. So I have to say it's one of those great ironies. I have a great colleague. I think Michael might remember him. His name is Edward Ift, and he's been one of the main U.S. experts on arms control negotiations in the nuclear realm for many years. He was my boss on the START Treaty in 1990 when I worked in Geneva on the START Treaty. And he has something called the IFT rule. The IFT rule is that both sides in a negotiations have the same position. The only thing is they have it at different times. And that is what I think has happened with the INF treaty. All of a sudden, it's funny, and this is good negotiating tactics on the part of the US administration. Suddenly the United States has a new missile, a ground-launched cruise missile in intermediate range, conventional only, not nuclear, planning to deploy it in Europe and in Asia. And suddenly Russia is saying, wait, we don't want that to happen. So I want to say to them, well, why didn't you think about that when you forced the withdrawal from the INF treaty? So long story short, we are at one of those moments when suddenly the Russians are beginning to change positions and be enthusiastic about INF constraints again. So, but it's not unusual, frankly, in the history of arms control negotiations for something like this to happen.
Awesome, thank you.
Michael Santos.
Good afternoon, thank you. My question is if you could elaborate on some of the specific ways you envision incentivizing China to come to the talking table. You mentioned that in your paper. And then I was wondering if you could give kind of the 180 view to what your take on China is. What someone might say just completely the opposite to you with the same end goal might help me understand a little bit more your position on China.
Yeah, what I think the most important thing now is to look at areas where China might have some equivalence with the United States and Russia, particularly at this moment. There are three areas that I think are very promising to look at for trying to engage their interest. You don't get a country to the negotiating table by whipping them to it. And that's what the Trump administration, that's an area I am pretty critical of them because they were trying to whip the Chinese and force them to the negotiating table and trying to shoehorn them into the new START treaty, and they just weren't going to play. But to say to them, look, you have an interest, you have, I mentioned already, very capable intermediate range ground launch systems. You're seeing more of them come into Asia, not only US systems, but also Russian systems. Don't we have a mutual interest in trying to put some constraints and limits on these systems? Another very promising area is their space-based assets, where we're seeing a great deal of new Chinese capability in outer space. And there could be some opportunities there for at least putting into place some rules of the road, some normative principles, perhaps banning certain kinds of technologies like direct ascent ASAT. There are a number of ideas out there. Again, I have no idea what the Biden administration will propose in this regard. But that's another very, I think, interesting area because the Chinese have some equivalence in capability and are watching very closely what the United States and Russia are doing. The third area, frankly, is hypersonic glide vehicles. Chinese, again, very, very good on the technology, deploying missiles in a number of different ranges that are hypersonic glide systems, the Russians as well, the United States as well. All right, there's another area where we could have a mutual interest in placing some constraints on such systems. So we will see what happens. In terms of what the larger goals are with China, in some ways, at least reading what's happened in the last 10 days, I think the administration in Washington will be pursuing a similar approach with China to the one they're pursuing with Russia. That is to try to carve out certain areas to cooperate. John Kerry was just in Beijing this past week to talk about climate change and to try to get the Chinese to come to the table and be serious about climate change, that other great existential threat. And so I think, they're going to try to carve out some areas while they continue to be very skeptical of Chinese behavior in other areas. And I've been very glad to see the very frank talk in this administration, starting with the Secretary of State in his confirmation hearing about concerns regarding the Uyghurs and the treatment of the Uyghurs and human rights abuses by the Chinese. So the administration is going to speak frankly to the Chinese, but also try to carve out some areas, I think, to try to work with them, including on strategic stability and in the nuclear realm. So I, for one, hope that they can make it happen. But it's a delicate balancing act. With the Russians, we've had lots of experience through the Cold War where we've had very severe differences on a number of issues, but still managed to continue negotiating about nuclear constraints. Chinese, we haven't had that experience, and that's another big problem. They aren't, I think, they haven't gotten their head around the fact that we can be negotiating about the nuclear systems, but still have very grave and serious differences of views on other issues of policy. So, well, we'll see how it goes, but it's going to take a while, I think, for them to become more comfortable with being at this particular negotiating table. Okay, next I have Jake Heckler.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture today. I have a question relating to zero knowledge verification, or more broadly, warhead verification. This morning, the NASEM, National Academy of Sciences review showed that there's pretty strong interest in doing things and going as far as opening up a facility to provide for testing of warhead verification techniques. This is great for me since I used to work on physical cryptography and zero knowledge methods at MIT with Areg and Kemp. But do you know if there's similar interest in the Russian Federation, in their universities or in their weapons laboratories?
All I can tell you, Jake, is what the Russians have told me, again, in second track settings. And this is an interesting little situation that's developed. We have a long history of working with the Soviets and the Russians on various demonstrations regarding nuclear warhead monitoring. I'm sure you're aware of it from your earlier work. And all of a sudden, they have shut up tighter than clams on this issue. So we're not getting the same willingness to talk about what's going on at the negotiating table. They've told us in a tantalizing way that there are many experts in their own laboratory system, in their university system, working on some of these issues, like what would be the cryptographic requirements for exchanging sensitive warhead data in the midst of a treaty regime. So there's certainly a lot, and you heard about it in the National Academy report, certainly a lot of thinking going on in the United States about that. I think there probably is thinking going on in the Russian Federation about this, but have they shared it with us? No, they have not. We know that there were some early experiments made where we were talking about zero knowledge with the Russians and how we could make use of that. But that's already over a decade, well over a decade old, and they seem very constrained politically from having an open discussion of this at the moment. So again, circling back to my earlier point at the outset, that for the United States, a high priority is going to be resuming, this principle that Trump established of direct limits on warheads and what that means for developing some monitoring and verification, intrusive monitoring and verification in sensitive warhead facilities. I think it's going to be a hard sell with the Russians, but I do think we have some good history, including working with them, and we need to try to brush that off to try to make the case that this is an area we've been working together in for a long, long time. So actually, I'd be interested in your view. How did you like the briefing this morning? And we have very few minutes left and a few more people, but if you could just say a word how you like the briefing this morning and what your thinking is.
I mean, I thought it was deeply confidence inspiring that people in the US are putting significant efforts towards developing facilities to allow for testing of different warhead verification techniques. That's a huge step forward, would have made my work a lot easier, and I think really paves the way for something that being built that is cryptographically credible and something that can be constructed. I'm concerned that the Russians are not talking in any way, especially with US experts, even in open settings like universities. And I hope that that can change in the near future.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to brief a group of Russian experts, young Russian experts tomorrow, actually, and I'm very curious to see if they show any hint of a broader discussion of this. I think they are sharply constrained at the moment politically, and it's going to take some work. Again, at the highest level, it's going to take Biden talking to Putin about this, I think, to get some of those constraints loosened. But thank you for that. Very, very interesting. Okay, another Jake Gutterman.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today. My question is in regards to Senate ratification of New START. How much of an advantage was it, and what impact did it play that, you know, at the time of ratification, the Senate was very not evenly divided. I think it was like 59 to 41 or something. So what impact did that play? And then how might, you know, we go if there is to be, you know, further future arms control agreements? What can we do in a more evenly split Senate and what seems to be an even more partisan DC?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's lots of debate about that at the moment, Jake, with some people throwing up their hands and saying we should never try to ratify another treaty. And my view is that this is one of the constitutional duties of the Senate. It's written into the Constitution that they give advice and consent to ratification. It's actually, people get confused. It's actually the president who ratifies the treaty, does the final sign off to bring it into force. But the all important constitutional role of the Senate is to give advice and consent to ratification. And frankly, they have been ducking this responsibility over a number of years. And it's not only nuclear treaties. It's important, you know, sometimes trade and economic treaties. It's treaties like the Law of the Sea Treaty, where it'd be very nice if we had more access at the moment to the kinds of law-governed approaches to the seabed that are inscribed in the Law of the Sea Treaty, but the Senate has always refused to give its advice and consent. My view is, and it was very strongly held by Vice President Biden at the time, that we could get the votes for the New START treaty as long as we gave the senators all the information they needed to make the case to them that the treaty is and was in the national security of the United States. So we went all out. My team and I, we had a huge interagency team, really, really good working this. I spent weeks up on Capitol Hill before the ratification vote, answered over 1,000 questions for the record. We had 22 hearings and briefings officially and countless meetings with senators and their staffs to make the case about the national security interest of the treaty for the United States. And yes, there was some horse trading. John Kyle, you know, shocking, John Kyle of Arizona was dead set that we needed to get the commitment of President Obama to nuclear modernization before New START could get across the finish line, because there was concern about Obama being, you know, the Prague Initiative president and wanting to get rid of all nuclear weapons. But even in his famous Prague speech, President Obama said that he understands total nuclear elimination would not take place in his lifetime. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, they must remain safe, secure, and reliable. So the president, even in the core of his Prague speech, had laid out a rationale for nuclear modernization. So it was not, you know, contradictory for President Obama to agree to funds for nuclear modernization back during the period when we were working on ratification of New START. So long story short, it's hard work, it's heavy lifting. We pulled out all the stops, but Vice President Biden was right, and so was Senator Lugar, God rest his soul, who said, we'll get the Republican votes as long as you make the case that this is in the US national security. The one final point that's so important here is that senators be allowed to vote their conscience. So often now it's the party line vote, and you see it on Capitol Hill day in, day out, the party line vote, and if anybody strays from that, I am hopeful going forward that we can make the case for treaty ratification processes, because the United States must have the ability to bring treaties into force. It's not just for nuclear arms control, it's for trade treaties, trade and economic treaties, all important, environmental treaties. We need to be able to have this instrument of international law available to us. And if the Senate basically refuses to allow the United States to have this important instrument of international law, I think that's gravely irresponsible. So I'm pretty outspoken on this. We'll see where it takes us going forward. Let's see, we have very few minutes left. I've got 2 questions left. First from Spiro, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Earlier you were talking about how the US might push, maybe other countries might do this, where they push for monitoring to be through private company satellites. And I was just wondering, given that, for example, you mentioned Microsoft, and for example, if it's an American company, could eminent domain become an issue in the information from these satellites if the companies are in America?
Well, I suppose so. We actually tried to wrestle with some of these questions, Spiro, in the course I taught winter quarter, and it was interesting. By the way, Michael, maybe I'll send you the syllabus that I used, just so people can see the number of topics that we covered and how we tried to go at it. So you're welcome to send it around.
That would be great. That would be great, Rose.
Yeah, and just for those of you who are interested in this subject, I'd be glad to keep in touch, because I'd like to hear more about your thinking on the matter. But honestly speaking, in the first instance, I think as long as there are assets commercially available and they're selling imagery, the question is who's going to pay in an international treaty regime? Who's going to pay? Is the United States somehow going to make funds available? Will there be some kind of international organization that takes over that responsibility? We tried to wrestle with a lot of these questions, and we did not get into the notion that somehow the commercial, there would be eminent domain requirements placed on the backs of the commercial operators. We tried to think about ways that they could continue to operate in the commercial space, but also then feed into a government process like an arms control treaty or agreement. So many questions out there. I don't think we got to perfect answers on any of them, but your question's a good one. Okay, last question from Mansak.
Thank you. I think your guest lecture is the most popular so far. And so during your guest lecture, you briefly mentioned the case of North Korea's participation in the future arms control treaty, multilateral. So what's going to be the case for North Korea's participation?
Well, it's, an excellent question. We haven't had much success, Mansiak, going to this point in terms of moving North Korea away from the pursuit of both very capable missile programs, but also their nuclear weapons program, their nuclear warhead program. Everybody's tried, including President Trump in his inimitable way, had his unique approach to the situation. But I had some interesting insights. And again, I think I'll just leave this with you all. And I think it's true that countries come to the negotiating table because they see their interests served. And one of the things that we started talking about in our course, and Jake Heckler is probably going to start laughing, but we talked about whether in some settings it might not be worthwhile to employ distributed ledger technology in some of these regimes. And it began to occur to some of us, including a couple of my people who worked on a project, that maybe the North Koreans would like to show off their prowess with regard to distributed ledger technology, and that this could be an area where we would say to them, okay, we know you don't want sensitive information about your warhead program or missile program or whatever, possibly getting out there. Well, what about we work together on a DLT? You show us what you can do to preserve the sensitivity of this data going forward. Now, Jake, before you comment, I know that's probably overkill in a bunch of settings, but nevertheless, it did seem interesting and appropriate to consider an area where the North Koreans, again, might have a special interest in showing off what they can do. And as always, it gets back to the very basic point I made. Countries do not come to the negotiating table because they are forced there by a stick or a whip. They come because they have some national interest. They think that it will benefit their national interest. So I'm afraid we're back to that with regard to North Korea, but I thought it was interesting to think about whether what they've done to become these Bitcoin maniacs might actually pay off in terms of providing for data exchange in some kind of warhead or missile regime. So we'll see. We'll see. The last point I'll make on this is I've been warned by one of the old timers. Some of you may know him. Again, James Fuller. Jim Miller is another guy, but Jim Fuller from Pacific Northwest Labs warned when we are looking at monitoring and verification of warheads, we need to be very careful that the monitoring regime is not more expensive than the warheads themselves. And that was always a caution that was in the back of our minds as we were working together on this course. But yeah, I'll be happy to share it. I'll send it to Michael and he can share it around. And again, those of you interested in pursuing the matter further, I'd be happy to hear from you. But thank you all. What a great discussion. Wonderful questions. I really appreciated it.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Rose,
Thank you.
Rose, thank you so much. You were billed as advertised, a superstar, and a superstar presentation, and you see the interest and energy of our students. You completely captivated them. Wish you
Well,
all the
thank
best.
you.
Wish you all the best, and if you make it to another round under the Biden administration, I'm sure our national security will be in safe hands.
Very good. Well, thanks again, Michael. Thank you to Carl for inviting me. Great time, and good luck to you all as you finish up the semester as well. All right, take it easy.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thank you.